It is early afternoon in Jerusalem, and the sky is doing something it should not do. The sun sits at its highest point, and yet the light is failing. Below, on a hill just outside the city walls, a cluster of Roman soldiers sit cross-legged in the dirt, playing a dice game for a folded piece of clothing. Above them, nailed to a wooden beam, a man is dying slowly, in public, exactly the way the empire intended anyone who challenged it to die. A little further off, a small group of women stand watching, unable to look away and unable to help. Behind all of them, the city of Jerusalem is packed with pilgrims who traveled for days to be here this week, most of them completely unaware that anything unusual is happening on a hill just past the gate. You can hear the city faintly from up here, the noise of a festival crowd going about an ordinary afternoon while a man dies within earshot of them. You are about to find out that nothing in this scene is random. Not the dice game, not the darkening sky, not the silence of the man on the cross, and not the words he finally does say. Every detail in front of you was written down, in ink, on a scroll, centuries before Rome ever built a cross to kill a man on. This is not a story about a coincidence. This is not a story about a lucky guess made after the fact. This is not a story about symbolism people imagined once they already knew how it ended. This is a story about 800 years of predictions made by different authors, in different centuries, under different kings, all converging on one afternoon, in one place, inside one body. There is one detail we are saving for the end, and you should hold on to it now. A line written by a shepherd who became a king nearly 1,000 years before Rome existed, describing something that, by all rights, he should not have had the words to describe yet. We are coming back to it, and when we do, you will understand why scholars still argue about it today, and why the argument itself only strengthens the case. Here is what you and I are going to do for the next half hour. We are going to walk through the last day of a man's life, hour by hour, and lay it next to prophecies written long before he was born. Some of these predictions came from a prophet writing 100 years earlier. Others came from a shepherd king 500 years before that. None of them ever met each other. None of them read one another's work. None of them lived to see a Roman cross. And yet somehow, all of their words point to the exact same afternoon. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will have to decide what to do with 8 centuries of matching evidence. Evidence you can go check for yourself the moment this video ends. Start the night before, in an upstairs room in Jerusalem. 13 men are eating together, reclining low around a table the way people did back then. You can almost smell the bread and the wine, and lamb roasting somewhere down the street for the festival crowds pouring into the city for the holiday. One of the men at that table has already made a decision the others do not know about yet, and he is eating with the rest of them as if nothing has changed. His name is Judas Iscariot. He has walked with this group for 3 years. He has watched the sick get healed and the hungry get fed, and tonight, for reasons the text never fully explains, he agrees to hand his own teacher over to the religious authorities for 30 pieces of silver. Before Judas slips out into the dark, the man at the head of the table breaks a piece of bread, passes it around, and tells the other 12 to remember him whenever they eat a meal like this one again. You may have heard those exact words repeated in a church you visited once, or at a wedding, or a funeral. What you may not know is that they were spoken for the very first time in this room, on this night, hours before anything else in this video happens. Here's what most people miss. 500 years earlier, a prophet named Zechariah wrote about a shepherd valued by his own people at exactly that price. 30 pieces of silver thrown into the temple, then used to buy a field. Judas will do precisely this. Within a day, he will take the silver, feel the full weight of what he has done, and hurl the coins back onto the temple floor. The priests, unwilling to put blood money into the treasury, will use the coins to buy a burial field for foreigners. Zechariah wrote every piece of that sequence: the price, the temple, the field, centuries before a treasury in Jerusalem ever held those coins. The Greek word the gospel writers use for what Judas does is paradidomi. It means to hand over, to deliver up, to release someone into another person's control. It is a small word, but the writers use it again and again through the story, almost like a drumbeat you can hear if you listen for it. Hand it over to the priests, hand it over to the Roman governor, hand it over to the soldiers, hand it over to death itself. Nobody in this account is simply arrested. Everybody is handed over, as though the whole night is being passed, hand to hand, towards something already decided long before anyone in that room was ever born. But it gets stranger. A few hours after that meal, in a garden outside the city, Under olive trees you can picture in the moonlight. The man kneels alone to pray while his closest friends fall asleep nearby, unable to stay awake even for 1 hour when he asks them to. Witnesses later describe him in such anguish that sweat falls from him like drops of blood hitting the ground. Whatever you imagine bravery looking like right before a death sentence, this is not it. This is a man who is terrified and prays anyway. Soldiers arrive to make the arrest soon after. One of the closest followers of the man they have come for, a fisherman named Simon Peter, panics and swings a sword, slicing off a soldier's ear. And the man they came to arrest does something nobody in that garden expects. He reaches out, touches the wound, and heals the soldier, on the spot, in the dark, in the middle of his own arrest. That same night, Peter will deny even knowing his teacher, not once, but 3 times, before a rooster crows, exactly as he was told he would only hours earlier at the same table you just pictured. He insisted it would never happen to him. He was wrong before dawn. If you have ever promised yourself you would be braver than you were, you already understand exactly how that night felt for him. Earlier that same night, before any of this reaches Pilate, the man stands before the high priest, Caiaphas, and the rest of the religious council in a hurried, irregular hearing held in the middle of the night. Caiaphas has his own reasons for wanting this resolved quickly. Months earlier, other religious leaders had worried out loud that if this man kept drawing crowds, the Romans would eventually step in, crush the unrest, and take away what little independence the nation still had left. Caiaphas gets his answer when the man, under oath, openly claims to be the Son of God. The council calls it blasphemy on the spot and votes for death, then walks him over to the one authority in the city who can actually carry out an execution, the Roman governor. By morning, the man has been passed from the religious court to the Roman governor, a man named Pontius Pilate. Pilate questions him and gets almost nothing back. No defense, no pleading, silence. At one point, Pilate even sends him to a local ruler named Herod, hoping to hand the whole problem off to someone else. Herod's soldiers mock him, dress him in a fine robe as a joke, and send him right back. Nobody wants responsibility for what happens next, and yet everybody keeps participating anyway. 700 years before that morning, a prophet named Isaiah described a suffering servant of God this way: oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Led like a lamb to the slaughter, and like a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Pilate is reportedly amazed by the silence in front of him. He has never watched a man on trial for his own life decline to defend it. Isaiah described that exact silence 7 centuries before Pilate was ever born, in a language Pilate probably never even learned to read. Here's the part nobody tells you. Pilate finds no legal case against this man. He says so, out loud, more than once, in front of a restless crowd. Looking for a way out, Pilate offers the restless crowd a choice, a yearly custom where one prisoner gets released at the festival as a gesture of goodwill. He sets the innocent man next to a convicted rebel and murderer named Barabbas, a man the crowd would already know by reputation, and asks them to pick which one walks free. You would expect the choice to be easy. It is not. Stirred up by the religious leaders standing nearby, the crowd shouts for Barabbas, a guilty man who broke the law and likely had blood on his hands already, and demands death for the one man Pilate has just said, out loud, is innocent. Barabbas walks out of that courtyard a free man, back to his family, back to his life, standing in the exact spot where the other one should have stood instead. No gospel writer needed a prophecy to explain what that exchange means for you. You can feel it without being told. Under pressure, Pilate hands him over to be crucified anyway. So in less than 12 hours, you have already watched 3 separate predictions land, made by 2 different prophets, centuries apart. A betrayal for exactly 30 pieces of silver. A field bought afterward with returned blood money. A silent prisoner standing in front of a Roman judge who cannot find a single crime to charge him with and hands him over regardless. If this is new to you, stay close, because there are more than a dozen predictions left, and the final one is the reason historians still talk about this afternoon 2,000 years later. Now watch what happens next. The soldiers strip him, mock him, twist together a crown out of thorn branches, and beat him with a multi-tailed whip designed to tear skin. A Roman historian named Tacitus, writing decades later in a work called the Annals, records almost in passing that a man called Christus was executed during the reign of Tiberius by order of the procurator Pontius Pilate. Tacitus was no friend of this movement, and he wrote about it with open contempt. But his account confirms, from completely outside the Bible, that this was a real execution of a real man, ordered by a real Roman official, not a legend invented later by grieving followers with nothing left to lose. Isaiah had already described the beating 500 years before Rome even controlled this part of the world. "I offered my back to those who beat me," he wrote, "my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting." Read that again slowly, because it deserves a second read. A prophet described spitting, beard-pulling, and a battered back centuries before a single Roman soldier ever lifted a whip in this city. Pilate orders a sign nailed above his head, meant as a piece of mockery, a label reading "King of the Jews" written out in 3 languages so nobody entering the city that week could miss it. Hebrew for the local crowd, Latin for the Roman officials, Greek for the traders and travelers passing through. Pilate meant it as an insult. You can decide for yourself whether an insult that gets read out loud in 3 languages by everyone walking past a busy city gate during the biggest festival of the year really stayed an insult for very long. On the way out of the city, too weakened by the beating to carry the crossbeam himself for long, the soldiers grab a random bystander out of the crowd, a man named Simon from Cyrene in North Africa, and force him to carry it the rest of the way. Simon almost certainly did not choose to be there. He was just a traveler pulled out of a crowd on his way into the city, handed the weight of someone else's execution, and made to walk the last stretch of the road with it on his own shoulders. You have probably felt at least once in your life what it is like to get handed a burden you never asked for and never chose. You may picture nails driven through the palms the way centuries of paintings have shown it, but many historians who have studied Roman crucifixion believe the nails more likely went through the wrists, since the small bones of an open palm could never support the weight of a full-grown man hanging for hours. It is a small correction, but it matters, because it tells you the writers describing this scene were not decorating it for effect. They were describing something they had actually watched happen to someone they knew. They lead him out to a hill and crucify him between 2 convicted criminals, men later Christian tradition would name Dismas and Gestas. Isaiah had written that this suffering servant would be numbered with the transgressors, counted among criminals in his death, as though he belonged there with them. He did not die alone in some dignified, separate way you might expect for someone people would later worship. He died, flanked by thieves, exactly as predicted, exactly as written 5 centuries before he was ever born. One of those 2 criminals joins the crowd in mocking him, daring him to save all 3 of them if he really has the power everyone claims. The other one, the man later tradition names Dismas, does something nobody expects from a convicted criminal hanging on his own cross. He tells the first thief to show some fear of God, since the 2 of them are only getting what their crimes deserve, while the man between them has done nothing wrong at all. Then he turns his head toward Jesus and asks to be remembered when Jesus comes into his kingdom. You would expect silence, or nothing, or a vague comfort meant for a dying man. Instead, he gets a direct answer. "Today, you will be with me in paradise." A convicted criminal, minutes from death, with nothing left to offer anyone, is told that today is enough. Pay attention to this next detail. As he hangs there, people passing by shake their heads and mock him. He trusts in God, they say. Let God rescue him now if God delights in him so much. 1,000 years earlier, King David wrote a psalm describing this precise scene. "All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him." David never saw a cross in his lifetime. Crucifixion as a method of execution did not exist yet when he wrote those words. And still, the mockery he wrote down matches, almost word for word, what bystanders will shout 1,000 years later on a hill he never lived to see and could never have visited, even if he had wanted to. Below the cross, soldiers divide his clothing among themselves and cast lots for one seamless garment rather than tear it into pieces. This is the same dice game you saw at the very start of this video. That same Psalm of David's, written a millennium before, says this exactly. "They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." A disciple named John, who stood at the foot of the cross that day along with the man's own mother, later wrote that he watched this happen and recognized the psalm being fulfilled right in front of him, detail for detail, while soldiers argued over cloth at the feet of a dying man. This is not a pattern you can explain away by saying prophets made vague, safe guesses that could apply to anyone. This is not a coincidence you can wave off as a common practice everyone could have predicted. This is not symbolism read backward by people desperate to make a tragedy mean something. This is a set of specific, falsifiable details, written centuries apart by strangers, converging on one execution, on one afternoon, on one hill outside one city. Here's where it gets remarkable. At noon, with the sun still high overhead, the sky goes dark. Not clouds passing by, not a brief eclipse lasting a few minutes. Darkness that covers the land for 3 full hours in the middle of the day, while the man on the cross is still breathing. Centuries earlier, a prophet named Amos had written that God would make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. Amos was not describing a metaphor for hard times. He was describing this exact afternoon, in this exact place. Here is a detail worth sitting with for a moment. The meal in that upstairs room the night before was a Passover meal, the yearly dinner built entirely around a lamb whose blood once protected a household from death, generations earlier in Egypt. On this particular afternoon, while the man on the cross was dying just outside the city walls, priests inside the temple were slaughtering that year's Passover lambs for the evening meal that same crowd would eat after sundown. The timing was not something anyone arranged. It was simply the day the festival calendar happened to fall on. And yet the man being called, even by his own followers, the Lamb of God, breathed his last during the very hour the actual lambs were being killed a short walk away. Picture standing in that crowd yourself, watching the sky go black in the middle of the afternoon, with no warning and no explanation offered to anyone standing there. And then, in the middle of that unnatural darkness, the man on the cross cries out in a loud voice, loud enough for the crowd below him to hear clearly, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Those words are not new, and if you know your Hebrew scriptures, you will recognize them instantly. They are the opening line of a psalm David wrote 1,000 years earlier, word for word. Anyone listening who knew the scriptures the way a first-century Jew would have known them would not have heard those words as a man simply losing his composure in his final moments. They would have recognized the opening line of a specific, well-known psalm, and in that culture, quoting the first line of a psalm was a way of pointing to everything that came after it, the way humming the opening bars of a familiar song reminds you how the rest of it goes. So follow the rest of that psalm now, because this is the detail you were asked to hold on to at the very beginning. A few lines further down, that same psalm says this, "They pierce my hands and my feet." Written 1,000 years before crucifixion existed as a method of execution anywhere in the ancient world, the Assyrians had not refined it yet. The Persians had not spread it across their empire. Rome had not perfected it into the public spectacle it eventually became. And yet a shepherd-turned-king, composing poetry centuries before any of that existed, used this specific image, hands and feet pierced through. For a long time, some scholars argued the original Hebrew word there was ambiguous, that without its vowel markings it could be read either as they pierced or as something closer to like a lion, since the two words look similar on the page in ancient Hebrew. It was a real, serious scholarly argument for generations, and not something invented by believers to win a debate. Then, in the middle of the last century, a shepherd boy searching for a lost goat threw a stone into a cave in the cliffs above the Dead Sea, heard something shatter, and climbed in to look. What he found inside changed the entire debate. Clay jars, hidden for 2,000 years, held some of the oldest copies of the Hebrew scriptures anyone had ever laid eyes on. Among the scrolls that scholars eventually pulled from those caves were ancient copies of the Psalms, hand-copied more than 100 years before Jesus was even born. Among them, this verse reads, "They pierced, not like a lion," written down, sealed away in a jar, buried in a desert cave, generations before crucifixion was ever invented as a punishment, and generations before any follower of Jesus could possibly have altered a single letter to make an old text fit what happened to him. That is the detail you were promised at the start. Hold that image now. Hands and feet, pierced, foretold 1,000 years early, preserved in a manuscript far older than the man it describes, sitting untouched in a jar for 2,000 years until someone finally opened it. There's one more thing before we reach the end. Soldiers come to break the legs of the men being crucified, a common method used to hasten death before nightfall. When they reach the man in the center, they find he is already dead, so they do not break his legs at all. Instead, one soldier, later tradition would even give him a name, Longinus, pierces his side with a spear, and something that looks like both water and blood flows out. Two separate predictions land in that single decision. A psalm had said God protects all his bones. Not one of them will be broken, echoing an old instruction that the bones of the Passover lamb must never be broken. and a prophet named Zechariah, writing 500 years earlier, had said, "They will look on him whom they have pierced." Both details, the unbroken bones and the pierced side, land in the same handful of seconds on the same body, fulfilling two separate predictions written in two entirely separate centuries. At that same moment, in the temple across the city, a massive curtain that separated ordinary people from the innermost sacred room tears in two, from top to bottom, on its own. A Roman centurion, standing at the foot of the cross, a professional soldier who has likely overseen more executions than he can count and felt nothing while doing it, says out loud that this man really was who he claimed to be. This is a man paid by Rome to stay unmoved by exactly this kind of death. You can imagine what it takes to make a hardened Roman officer say something like that in public, in front of his own men, about a prisoner he just helped kill. Afterward, a wealthy man named Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the religious council who had not agreed with the decision to execute him, works up the courage to ask Pilate for the body and buries it in his own new tomb. Isaiah had written, 700 years earlier, that this suffering servant would be assigned a grave with the wicked, yet be with the rich in his death. He died among criminals. He was buried among the wealthy. Both halves of that one strange, specific prediction land within the same single day. You do not have to take any of this on faith alone. In the last century, a mathematician named Peter Stoner sat down and tried to calculate the actual odds of just 8 of these predictions being fulfilled by chance in one person within one lifetime. He used deliberately conservative estimates, and he had his math checked by other mathematicians and scientists before he ever published it. His answer, 1 chance in 100 quadrillion. To help ordinary people grasp a number that large, he offered a simple illustration you can picture right now. Cover the entire state of Texas in silver dollars, 2 feet deep, from border to border. Mark just one of those coins. Blindfold a man, let him wander anywhere across that state, and tell him to bend down and pick up exactly 1 coin at random. The odds that he picks the marked one on his very first try are roughly the odds Stoner calculated for 8 predictions landing by chance on a single man. Tonight, you have just watched more than 8 land on one afternoon, and depending on how narrowly or broadly you count them, other teachers have tallied more than 100 distinct predictions echoed across this man's entire life, not just this single day. We only had time tonight for the ones packed into one afternoon, so here is what all of this actually means for you. First, the plain truth of it. The details of this execution were not vague, and they were not written after the fact by people trying to force an old story to fit new events. They were specific, they were falsifiable, and they were on public record centuries before the event, preserved in manuscripts you can still go read today. Second, what it means for you personally. If these words were true enough to land on one afternoon with this kind of precision, then the rest of what surrounds them, the claim that this death opened a door for you specifically, the claim that it was not the end of the account, deserves more than a passing glance from you. Maybe you grew up hearing this story so many times it stopped sounding like history to you and started sounding like furniture in the background of your life. Maybe you are hearing most of it for the first time tonight. Either way, you do not have to accept any of it before you go to bed tonight. But it is worth more than 5 quiet minutes of honest thought on your part this week, away from a screen, without anyone watching you think it through. And third, the part that should stay with you the longest. Every single one of these predictions describes suffering. Betrayal, mockery, piercing, thirst, darkness, and a cry of abandonment. Whatever else this day was, it was not distant, and it was not painless. Notice, too, what none of these prophecies describe. A king arriving on a throne, untouched, immune to the ordinary weight of pain the rest of us carry. Every single line points instead to a man who bled, who thirsted, who felt abandoned in the dark, just like you have, at least once, in a moment you may never have told anyone else about. If you have ever felt forsaken, ever cried out into what felt like total silence, the man at the center of this story knew that exact feeling, word for word, because he quoted it out loud while it was happening to him, in front of witnesses, in broad daylight turned dark. Which one of these predictions hit you the hardest? Tell me down in the comments. I read every single one, even the long ones. One more thing worth saying before you go. The story does not actually end at that tomb outside the city, and what happens 3 days later is exactly why the earliest witnesses stopped grieving and started telling anyone who would listen. That, though, is a video for another day, and if you want it, Subscribing is the fastest way to make sure it lands in front of you. Because in the end, this was not a story about a number of fulfilled prophecies. This was not a story about a mathematician's calculation. This was not a story about probability at all. This was a story about a promise, made across 8 centuries by people who never once met each other, kept in full, on one afternoon, in front of witnesses who wrote down exactly what they saw, so that you, 2,000 years later, would not have to take it on their word alone.